Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Tipping Points of Building the US Offshore Wind Supply Chain. If people could just write into the chat if the sound is okay for them, if they can hear me well, and if there isn't a lot of feedback. If you can't hear properly, please let me know. Okay, great. Seems to be fine for everyone. So thank you again. Just over 1,000 people have signed up today, so that is great. And thank you in advance for all of today's speakers, who I will introduce shortly. But this webinar is one of several pieces of work that we're doing in conjunction with the US Offshore Wind 2020 conference in Boston, June 18 and 19. So before we start the webinar, I'm just going to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the conference itself, where the US offshore wind supply chain is one of the main key features of this event. So the conference incorporates all of the key areas that the industry has asked us to focus on for 2020, from offshore wind project execution to supply chain expansion and environmental permitting. There are three main tracks, several workshops, and a new supply chain accelerator program. And we're expecting over 2,000 attendees, including 200 speakers. We've already confirmed Alicia Barton, the CEO of NYSERDA, Bill White, Managing Director of ENBW North America, Hein van Gant from Boskalis, Scott London, Head of Permitting for Equinor Wind US, Alla Weinstein, the CEO of Castle Wind, and Michael Pfefferman from GE Energy Renewables, and many more, which can be found on our main Reuters Events US Offshore Wind website and in the brochure. We'll also be covering a huge range of topics, from upcoming US offshore wind projects to US offshore wind market analysis, fixed and floating systems technologies, financing, construction and installation, transmissions and the grid, ports and vessels, permitting, environmental impacts, and stakeholder engagement and policy development. Within that, the Supply Chain Accelerator Program has been developed to facilitate in-depth business meetings between project developers and Tier 1 manufacturers and service providers with Tier 2, 3, and 4 manufacturers to help resolve both state-specific local content requirements whilst boosting hyperlocal offshore wind supply chain across the East Coast and incorporating European companies within that. The event is essential for anyone looking to become a partner, project develop, or enter the supply chain at any level. And then the second main component of our event is the US Offshore Wind Supply Chain Exhibition, where you can network and explore with over 100 exhibition booths who are all leading the US offshore wind supply chain at the moment. The event brochure is available as a downloadable PDF, which I'll email to everyone after the webinar, but it can also be found on the main US Offshore Wind website, and you can download it directly. Anyway, so moving on to the webinar itself, today I would like to welcome and thank today's speakers. So first of all, there's our chairman, Owen Quinn, who is the Global Director for Offshore Wind with Worley, who will be discussing how the supply chain can be leveraged from other industries and transitioning workforces. Then next we have John McCaskill, Director from the Offshore Wind Consultants, who will be presenting the risks associated with developing a new supply chain and how a European model can be adapted. Samuel Byrne, who is the Energy Program Manager with Maryland Energy Administration, will present Maryland's current local content requirements and the incentives for investing and joining the US offshore wind supply chain. Then Barry Logie, who is the Vice President for Renewable US with Scottish Development International, will be highlighting some of the non-technical services such as vessel requirements and the financial aspects of the US wind. And finally, Matthew Vestal, Senior Advisor for Large-Scale Renewables with NYSERDA, will highlight some of New York State's local content requirements, their incentives, and investing into the US offshore wind supply chain. There will be time at the end for the audience to ask questions to the panelists. If you notice the chat box on your screen, lots of you have already messaged in to ask questions. You can type questions in, and at the end, we'll try and get through as many as possible. The webinar will be approximately 60 minutes, and you'll all be sent the recordings in a couple of days. So without further delay, I will hand you over to the chairman, Owen Quinn.
Thanks, Emily. Just going to share my screen. Okay. Emily, are you able to see the screen okay?
Yes, it's great.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning and good day to everybody that's on the call. Today, obviously kicking off the presentation is a key topic for the sector, but also for ourselves within Worley. As Emily mentioned, just get rid of this. As Emily mentioned, I'm speaking today on behalf of Worley, and Worley is a global engineering consultancy company with over 60,000 people worldwide. And why I'm saying that is we've got 11,000 engineering consultants based out of the US. So when we talk about supply chain and the effects of that, not only is it important for our clients, but it's also important for ourselves internally. When we look at the energy transition, which is what we're faced with at the moment, it's about not only transitioning the generation of electricity and energy, but it's also about it's about transitioning that capability. So today I'm going to really just touch through some of the key focus topics that we're seeing in the industry itself, and what our clients are seeing. We're very, very active in this space at the moment, and we're assisting the clients as they move from the more mature markets of Europe into what we call the emerging markets of the US. And the challenges, of course, are the fundamental pipeline. The challenge that we're faced with is this large growth of offshore wind capacity that's been released. The timelines are very close together. So the first hurdle that I'm just going to outline here today is it comes back to the ports. And when you break it back, the anticipated project development up to 2030, it's going to require 1 to 5 ports per region in order to actually deliver the capacity that we're talking. So that's quite challenging. And when you break that down further, we're seeing that when you look at Europe, we've got large mega ports, facilities with deep waters that can harness this capacity, or that can service this capacity. But when you look at what we have in the US, there is a shortage of heavy lift cranes. So we're having to liaise and work with what we have at hand, and that's smaller onshore cranes, and it creates an element of complexity. It's an interesting environment in this space when you're looking at the ports, particularly the fact that each developer are courting the states, got a number of states in competition with one another, and therefore as a result of that competition, there's a need not only for massive investment into the infrastructure, but also there's a need for collaboration and a more holistic view. So this is the area that we're certainly highlighting as one of the key concerns across the US. Sorry. Next up, just going to quickly touch on what we're seeing from a perspective of transmission. Large forecasted developments from the likes of New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, right along the northeast coast. Again, comes back to that key word of complex supply chain. And when you look back to the European standards, we've seen a sector grow from an R&D basis out to what we now call, as I mentioned at the start of the call, a more mature market, and how we can service that. And the local supply chain demands, of course, are present in the US. So as a result, subsequent projects, particularly with large interconnectors, they're going to be faced with large costs, and there's an opportunity here for collaboration, and we're seeing that at the moment. When you look at a global footprint, the US is in a bit of a unique position when you compare it to the likes of Asia, for example. We're starting to see more collaborative models between utilities and developers. So therefore, it's an interesting space to be monitoring, particularly from a supply chain perspective. Moving into offshore wind engineering expertise, and I think this is one that's going to catch many people's eye on the call today. The US has been at the forefront of major engineering challenges over the years. If you break it back to the 1970s, floating systems have been deployed into the Gulf Coast. A lot of that capability is down in the southeast and southwest. We ourselves within Worley, we're active in the northeast coast and delivering topside assets and transmission cables. But I suppose breaking that expertise back, we're leveraging what the existing state-of-the-art offshore wind expertise from the oil and gas sector. But is that transferable to the oil and gas? We're seeing in areas it can be, but it needs an adaptation, and there's an adaptation period that's certainly necessary. Core engineering design in the US would certainly bring down the cost in the long run, but we're seeing that in order to optimize this supply chain, we need to do it more rapidly, and we need to get more commitment. So there needs to be an incentive plan to do that. Developers are certainly trying to bridge the gap between, that early stage R&D, that early stage creativity with university programs. So we're seeing the likes of developers working with universities, the likes of Orsted and Tufts, which is a good example. I point out here that flagship vessels, that's another key area, and I know the Jones Act is certainly a buzzword within the industry, and we're starting to see how we can navigate that. But it's going to remain to be a challenge, and it's a challenge going forward in how we can engineer around these factors. So, in summary, just addressing the key areas that we've highlighted, the US will certainly evolve differently from Europe. Northern Europe was heavily subsidized, as I mentioned before, and the local government propelled regional companies across Europe once the market had reached maturity. So we're seeing that capability transition from Europe into the US. One of the key factors for Europe's success has been the ports and also the higher tariffs. In the UK, for example, where we're based at the moment, there's been a strong oil and gas base and that industry to be leveraged from. And the US has got the ability to leverage that as well. The UK and that knowledge within Europe has certainly, we've seen the transition, and it's a reachable and addressable market. It's unlikely that we think personally internally that it's unlikely that the US will follow the same example to a lesser extent within the US, from Europe. We're starting to see that, particularly in the Northeast, there's going to be a continued benefit for knowledge to knowledge from those European centres to help carve the supply chain and improve the efficiencies. The US, finally, in terms of local resources, its success story in the future is going to be offshore wind, and it's the ability of leveraging that knowledge, that capability. Now, if you break it back 12 months ago or even 18 months ago, these were aspirational targets, and we're starting to see unusual models, SPV models between competitors being formed, supply chain mapping getting right out from early stage advisory all the way to fabrication and secondary steelworks, which can be carried out along the northeast coast and down into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a dynamic sector, and it's ever evolving. Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. So
yeah, John, I'm going to stop sharing now. I think that might have happened. And over to you.
Okay, Owen, can I ask you if you can see my slides?
Not yet.
That's because I need to press the button. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. You're all good.
Great stuff. Okay, great stuff. Thanks, Owen. And one of the one of the elements that Owen's mentioned for this will be pipeline and pipeline development, and I'll show you that in a minute. So John McCaskill worked for a company called Offshore Wind Consultants, which we do what it says on the tin very quickly. We're part of the Aqualis Braemar Group, which is an energy adjusting and offshore consultancy, of which we are a piece. We deliver technical advisory, engineering and project management services to developers and investors. We've been around since about 2011. We've had assignments and worked on about 40 gigawatts of projects. That equates to about 65 projects, and we're in London, Edinburgh, Hamburg, Taipei, Boston, and Australia as well. But onto the, I'm just going to move a window that I've got that's covering it. What we're going to see in the US, like all other emerging markets, is going to be an evolution of a supply chain, and it's going to have very national specifics that Owen explained really well, but will have it develop slightly different from every other market. But it's going to evolve because first projects need to balance some kind of local content, whether that's regulated or whether that's political, and cost and risk. So you have supply chains that are quite different on early projects, and it develops as domestic supply chains start to evolve, and the actual scale develops. So what we've got here is a bit of a taxonomy of that. So let's just go through from top to bottom. First, covering the turbine. Early projects will come from Europe because that's where the three large turbine manufacturers are based. In the medium term, it is highly likely that GE will want to try and exploit its domestic market. It's already got onshore turbine facilities, so it's very likely that it will build a factory at the moment. Obviously, it supplies from its two French factories. Siemens Gamesa and MHIV are highly likely to build factories if the pipeline, which is what Owen mentioned, develops, provides scale. That will probably at least assembly and blades. We would probably see the existing subcomponent supply chain probably still being existing in Europe, because it would take a lot for that to be repeated in the US. When it comes to towers, the US already has a large domestic tower onshore supply chain, including the likes of Arcosa, Broadwind, etc. But they are expensive, and they're continuously lobbying, or they have been quite recently, to try and have steel tariffs to try and reduce the amount of towers coming from the APAC. So at the moment, we probably see Europe and APAC supply for the early projects, because these facilities are not on the coast where they need to be able to produce the larger offshore wind towers. But we can see that APAC will still supply the US as it currently does with onshore, but it's very likely in the medium term that a US supply chain for towers can and will develop as well. Now looking at foundations, so jackets first. Very challenging fabrication. In terms of jackets, we see Europe and the Middle East being very likely for the initial projects. Later projects, it's highly likely that the US can start producing smaller fab. At the moment, they do produce down in the Gulf the jackets, though the larger top sides now tend to come in from APAC, and then they're consolidated. There's quite a developed oil and gas fabrication supply chain in the Gulf Coast from Alabama to Texas. However, like all oil and gas fabrication facilities, there's no serial production experience, which is the high risk, which is where significant issues usually appear in contracts for jacket foundations. However, we are seeing moves from the European supply chain to come into the US, and that will increase. So EEW has plans for a facility in Paulsboro. So we do see that will be more likely in the medium term. So you might see a range of joint ventures between European suppliers that are trusted by the developers, or they've been used previously in Europe and elsewhere, with possible joint ventures with US fabricators. In terms of pin piles, pin pile supply for Europe is already beginning to drift to lower cost places, for instance, China and the APAC. So certainly initially from APAC, and that will probably continue maybe with some fabrication in the US, especially if it can try and put walls up to try and reduce the amount of APAC supply through things like steel tariffs. Monopiles, very similar to the jacket foundations at the top. There isn't any serial production of monopiles, so initially that will be coming in from Europe, maybe some of the APAC facilities that have now started to supply monopiles for European projects and APAC projects, but we can see that facilities will be constructed in the US at port facilities. When it comes to the offshore substation, that is, if you're looking at one of the early stage projects, that's an obvious package or element that you feel could be fabricated in the US. Early projects will be totally dependent on the strategy of the developer, so the supply of the USS will probably be anywhere between Europe, the Middle East and the US. The Gulf Coast has a number of fabricators that are well positioned to be able to supply the OSS, Gulf Island, Keppel, Armfels, Kiewit, Dynamic. Also, fabricators in Mexico will be able to supply this, and also in Canada. They're about 1,500 to 2,000 nautical miles from the Gulf Coast, most Gulf Coast fabrications to the northeast. So it's really down to risk and costs, but we see that as a possibility. However, you've got to remember that US is more expensive than China and APAC, for instance. Cables, so inter-array and export, they'll come from the current suppliers in the main for early stage projects, APAC, Europe, the US, etc. And that sort of mix will continue, but we do see that US facilities will be likely. One interesting turn was Vineyard looking at Marmon Utility for about 50% of the supply of cables, possibly for the Park City project. Now, just next slide. So, however, when local content starts to appear into the supply chain, then it's going to be relatively immature, and developers and investors have to manage that. And of course, you know, we've learned these lessons in Europe. It's quite immature, it's quite a well-known and experienced supply chain. But we've started to see this in places like Taiwan, etc. And there's lessons to be learned in terms of developing for local supply chains. So what we wanted to do is use maybe the example package with some aspects that you would try and deploy to try and reduce risks of a local content, which is maybe a less experienced. So the first thing is, can developers bring in trusted suppliers into the new market to either build a facility or create a joint venture, so providing knowledge transfer? We've seen EEW make a statement about coming into Paulsboro, but also if you look as far as APAC, you're seeing the likes of Black come in and do joint ventures for projects. So that's knowledge transfer. It's trying to mitigate and reduce risk. The other is don't single source. Try and use multiple contractors, but of course you've got to make sure that there's clauses and the project management to be able to allow you to descope one contract and upscope the other, to move units from one supplier to the other. Now, if I can just jump down to the fourth bullet there, now that means that if there is some either agreement or understanding on local content, then try and engage early with the authorities, because if you do have to move content and you're moving content from a local supplier because of risk
John,
issues,
sorry to interrupt.
schedule issues. Yep.
John, we've got to wrap it up soon enough just for the next presenter. Yes.
No problem. Don't underestimate the run period time for bringing in the new facilities. Incorporate mock-up fabrication pieces, test cutting, welding, etc. And for the investors, can the developer take the supply chain risk off the table for early stage projects? I'll finish there, Owen. Okay. Obviously, I think slides will be available as well, so people can pore over it at leisure.
Good man. Thanks, John. So next up, we've got Sam. Sam, do you want to share your screen and we can get into the presentation before we open it up for questions on the floor?
Yep, I'm ready to go. Just share the screen. All right, can everyone hear me and see the screen okay?
Perfect, yep. Good man,
All right,
Sam.
sounds good. So as I said before, I am Sam Byrne. I'm with the Maryland Energy Administration. This is the Maryland State Government's Energy Office. Sorry, there we go. This is just what we do, but in the interest of time, I'll skip that. So in Maryland, back in 2013, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. What I'm really going to do today is just quickly provide an overview of Maryland's offshore wind market and some of our local content requirements that occurred during the first round of OREC procurement for the US Wind and the Skipjack projects. That Skipjack project is being developed by Ørsted. So the Maryland market really got started in 2013 with passage of the Maryland Offshore Wind Energy Act. Now, all of the details of that bill are included in the center column here. And really what that bill did was it created the market with a 2.5% of all in-state electricity sales, which roughly translates to about 1.7 million megawatt hours per year. And if we assume a capacity factor of 40%, that roughly translates to about 500 megawatts. Now, back in 2017, as you all know, Maryland was the first state government to embark on a competitive procurement process for offshore wind in the United States. And that's what you'll see as the 388.8 megawatts. Now, last year, the Maryland Clean Energy Jobs Act, which occurred in 2019, expanded upon that first bill. So it increased our goal, our carve-out, more than fourfold to 10% of all in-state electricity sales, which translates to 6.8 million megawatt hours per year, and has a required additional minimum of 1,200 megawatts, and that's broken down in 400 megawatts by 2026, an additional 400 in 28, and an additional 400 in 2030, and so ramping up to 1,200 megawatts by 2030. That is in addition to what we did under round one, which is that center column. Round two is the far right column. Now, all of the other rows there, that's just some of the requirements for the projects, which includes some of the minimum threshold eligibility requirements on distance, location, interconnection, as well as the caps for the OREC price, the residential rate impact, and the non-residential rate impact, which I'm going to skip all that for now. Now, as I said, in 2017, the Maryland Public Service Commission approved 2 offshore wind projects in Order 88192. That is the Skipjack offshore wind farm, which is a 120 megawatt project being developed by Ørsted. It was a deep water wind project, but became Ørsted when they merged. And it's going to equate to about 0.6% of all in-state electricity sales. They can generate a max 445,000 ORECs annually, and it'll serve about 37 Maryland homes. The second project is US Wind's Maryland Offshore Wind Farm. This project was approved initially as 248 megawatts. However, they have notified the Maryland Public Service Commission that they are considering different turbines, and ultimately it will change the final capacity of the project. But what they have stated so far is that it's 268.8. This project is going to be about 1.3% of total in-state electricity sales and serve about 76,000 Maryland homes. Both projects were approved at $131.93, and that's in 2012 dollars. But the way that the OREC works is that the energy revenues from the projects are rebated to Maryland ratepayers. The net cost to Maryland ratepayers is actually lower at $70.18, again in 2012 dollars. Now, as part of the review process for these OREC projects, they have to meet a net benefit test to Maryland's economy, public health, and the environment. So that first one, that public benefit or the net benefit to Maryland's economy, the way that the developers proposed to meet that was by providing investment and job creation in the state of Maryland. So that's what I have laid out here. By law, any OREC approval is required to, those developers are required to provide $6 million to the Offshore Wind Business Development Fund. That is a pot of money that we have here at the Maryland Energy Administration, and it's what we are using to help support Maryland's supply chain. In addition, both of the developers proposed port improvements as well as investments in steel manufacturing facilities in Maryland. So combined, both of the developers need to invest about just shy of $40 million in ports in Maryland, as well as $76 million in a steel manufacturing facility or facilities within the state. Now, Ørsted's project, the Skipjack Offshore Wind Farm, has already stated that they will, actually they've already leased space at one of Maryland's largest ports. It's the Trade Point Atlantic facility just outside Baltimore City. This is a 3,250 acre port facility right on the water. It used to be one of the largest steel manufacturing facilities in the world, once employing about 30,000 people. But as that industry slowly declined over the previous decades, that facility shuttered in 2012 and essentially was completely demolished and is a blank slate for the most part. So Ørsted is leasing about 50 acres to use as a final assembly site as well as marshalling for their Skipjack project. So they have already invested that $13.2 million into Maryland as required. In addition, the Maryland Public Service Commission also required both of the developers to spend a certain percentage of their in-state capital expenditures as part of these programs during the constructions and development phase only. So Ørsted has to spend 19% of that total, which translates to just shy of $120 million within Maryland, and US Wind's is, I'm sorry, Ørsted is 34% and US Wind is 19%. Which translates to about $235 or so million over the next few years. And then if you combine all of those things together for both developers, these two developers collectively have to invest close to $361 million in Maryland. In addition, they also both have to use an operations and maintenance port in the state, preferably Ocean City, since that's really the only option. In addition, Skipjack has to have an operations center for its projects in the state as well. And this is also in addition to the 5,000 or so direct full-time equivalent jobs that they are required to generate from these projects over the course of the entire lifetime of those projects. And again, the main reason why these are the local content requirements for these projects is because this was what was first proposed by the developers, and the PSC agreed and made it a requirement for the most part. Now, as I mentioned before, we have the Offshore Wind Business Development Fund that developers pay $6 million into for each OREC approval. We have already received those investments from the developers, satisfied that last summer. And we, in turn, are sending this money back into Maryland's local supply chain. And really what we're doing is helping existing companies or new companies in the state prepare and get ready for the offshore wind supply chain, or the offshore wind industry rather, and to work on these projects that we've approved. So over the last 3 years, we've offered a offshore wind business CapEx investment program, which really just seeks to help reduce that upfront barrier cost to market entry for local companies. In addition, we also have our workforce training program where we are providing funding to workforce training centers for, again, CapEx for new equipment or training facilities for the offshore wind industry, as well as funding can be used for curriculum development or licensing of existing curriculums, or even operating costs for training students at no cost to the student. And largely this program seeks to expand the labor pool of blue-collar trade skills in Maryland, since certain skills like, say, welding, there is a national shortage of close to 400,000 people. So we're just trying to expand the labor pool for when this industry comes. And so I'll leave it there. If you guys have any follow-up questions, feel free to send me an email at win.mea@maryland.gov. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Cheers, great presentation. Okay, next we're going to pass on to Barry. Barry, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Hold on.
Share your screen. Take your time. Okay, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Good man.
There we go. So my name is Barry Logan. I'm with Scottish Development International. I am based in the US and am representing efforts in the offshore wind to bring you Scottish expertise into the market to help bring offshore wind a little bit closer. Today, I just had a very simple question. Construction vessels are essential to the installation, obviously, of our wind turbines. And over the last year, we've all been asking, when will we see one that's a US flagged, Jones Act compliant? And my simple question is, are we any closer? I'd like to credit Kettle Arvidsson of Fred Olsen Wind Carrier, because I'm cheating and using one of his slides, which he presented earlier this year, which gives us a very succinct view on what is going to happen and where the bottleneck will be should we fail to invest into a construction vessel that can operate within the US industry. This shows the stack up of the projects that are currently leased and with the various developers. The red line is what's most indicative here, is that if a keel was laid down for a turbine installation vessel, the construction timeline is about 3 years. So in this window, the industry will still have to go through the transition of a turbine installation vessel from the European market, bringing it into the US market and using some manner of feeder barges. But within the last 6 months, as we all know, the US, the introduction of the GE 12 megawatt turbine has changed the installation view of what we can do with what we have and how can we bootstrap when all of a sudden we now have to accommodate these much larger blades and much larger turbines. So as we look at this, the question about this supply chain seminar was, what is the tipping point? So as we look at this stack up of US projects, there seems to be an enormous pipeline in the future. And so what is keeping shipbuilders from making the commitment to the US market? We have 24 gigawatts, and that's probably a little conservative, in the pipeline, and it seems every month a new state either adds to or increases their interest in offshore wind. We expect that there's technology risk. The turbines are getting larger, the blades are getting longer, the monopiles are getting bigger. We obviously are under the shadow right now of consent risk with the various projects as BOEM goes through its additional review of the various projects along the Atlantic seaboard. And then the internal return on investment for the shipbuilders. A study was done in 2017 based on 2017 technology that would estimate that a turbine installation vessel built in the US would cost like $222 million. And obviously that would, the report stated that it would require about 4 gigawatts of pipeline to justify that. I believe we're looking at, states that have at least 4 gigawatts on the books for their plans, and many of those are now signed up for either the Siemens Gamesa large turbine or the GE large turbine. So just trying to revisit this idea of are we going to run into a bottleneck given that suitable turbine installation vessels globally has diminished because of the technology advances? The US market is looking to be as efficient as possible, and if we work with larger turbines, larger blades, larger foundations, are we going to be having to have a fleet of barges available that may come from the Gulf or may not be suitable depending on what specifications need to be addressed with the larger turbines? And then the question comes back to is, how do we finance this? How is the finance community looking at this, and what is going to draw them into the US market? It seems like there's an idleness there, and a wait. And unfortunately, as we saw on that graph, the vessels take multiple years, from a crew transfer vessel to a support operation vessel. each of those would have to be underway today to be available 2 to 3 years from now. So I'll keep my comments brief today, just so that we have some time for questions. But my question really remains, what is the significant risk that the shipbuilders see, and how can we address it? And with that, I'll turn it back to Owen.
Excellent, good man. Thank you very much. Great presentation. So look, we're going to open it up now to the floor for questions. So I think the best route is if you want to start asking questions to the organizers. Emily, I think I'll get you to ask those questions because you can see them. Actually, I can't. But what I will do before I do hand over to Emily is just maybe a question for Sam, given your experience.
Hold on 1 second. We still have Matthew Vestal.
Oh, my apologies.
That's okay. And then we'll just do some questions at the end. We might run over slightly, but that's fine.
Yeah. Good stuff. Matthew,
no problem at all. Great. I'll be able to move quickly here in the interest of time as well. So again, my name is Matthew Vestal. I'm Senior Advisor for the Large Scale Renewables team at NYSERDA, which is effectively the New York State Energy Authority for all things offshore wind related, as well as our land-based programs as well. So at a high level, the introduction to the New York market should begin with the legislation that we have on the books. Last July, Governor Cuomo signed the CLCPA, which is the Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act, which is the most aggressive climate legislation in the country, which, among other things, commits New York State to 100% clean, carbon-free electricity by 2040. And a subset of that is a 9 gigawatt mandate for offshore wind by the year 2035. And so we recognize that offshore wind is a lucrative investment for New York State for many reasons, but among which include the economic development potential that this industry offers. And so you'll see here on this slide, not only will the industry support approximately 30% of New York's load by 2035, but also through the billions of dollars in infrastructure that are required to support the industry, as well as the 10,000 plus jobs that we expect to see come from this supply chain. This is truly an investment that New York State looks forward to making. There are several strategic advantages that New York has relative to its peers. I know that we've talked a bit today about competition between states, so I think it's worth noting what makes New York stand out. First and foremost, that 9 gigawatt goal, or I should say mandate, is the largest in the country. And beyond that, we also have the largest electric load in the region, which means that we have the largest potential to serve the market in the long term. So I think beyond 2035, we certainly expect that offshore wind will continue to dominate, certainly the downstate electric sector here in New York. We're also centrally located. You can see on this slide the number of Northeast-based federal lease areas that currently exist, as well as those that we expect to see leased in the near term from BOEM. And New York is nicely positioned, again, between the states such as Maryland, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. We also benefit from a few different geographies that can support port facilities, those primarily being Long Island, New York Harbor, and the Hudson River, all of which offer distinct advantages for different elements of the supply chain. But on top of all this, we also have millions of dollars that are accessible for the supply chain to support local businesses, business and infrastructure development. And so I think this slide here really shows the priorities for New York State in moving the supply chain forward. One thing that we haven't talked a lot about today is workforce development, which we see as a vital component of the broader supply chain development. We need our workers to be trained to be able to step in to those supply chain investments whenever they're ready to go. So to that end, the state has committed to investing $20 million in an offshore wind training institute. This will work hand in hand with the 4 other components noted here on this slide. As we move to the right, we have our offtake contracts, which somewhat unique among our state peers. We do not have local content requirements, but we do have an evaluation criteria that rests 20% on local economic benefits and job creation. So that is really a strong incentive for project developers to invest in local markets. On top of that, NYSERDA leads efforts related to engagement activities through supply chain forums and technical workshops that generally attract hundreds of members of the offshore wind supply chain to local markets here in New York, and that's connecting local businesses with those in the broader offshore wind industry. But in connection with that, we also have investments in port infrastructure specifically. So I know we've talked about ports quite a bit today, but New York State is, again, unique here in our commitment to invest up to $200 million in port infrastructure through a competitive RFP. This RFP is about to be kicked off now. This was referenced in the governor's State of the State address just a couple weeks ago. And again, this will be invested in one or more port facilities to address the needs that my other panelists have mentioned today. And on top of this, we do have general business development incentives that are highlighted on the slide in front of you here. So there are, again, keeping an eye on time, and I know we'll be able to share these slides, so I won't dive into too much detail here, but I think it's worth noting that we have a plethora of opportunities for business and infrastructure expansion from a 0% income tax for manufacturers to refundable tax credits for job creation, workforce development initiatives, low-cost power, what have you. And so New York really is a great place to do business, and we continue to work with the industry to drive investments in our local markets. So happy to take any questions, and I will leave it there.
Excellent, great stuff. And my apologies, Matt, on nearly missing you out there. Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll open up the questions that I was mentioning earlier. Emily, you're going to have to ask the questions that are coming in from the group, as I can't see them. But I do have just one or two questions just for the panelists before we hand it over to Emily, if that's okay. Matt, I might actually just start with you, if that's okay. You mentioned about workforce development. What's been the challenge in addressing that from your side of things within NYSERDA? What's been the challenges, I suppose, to map out exactly where are the risks for this pipeline and portfolio going forward?
Sure. So I think specifically related to workforce development, the biggest question is one of timing. I think ensuring that we are training workers at the right moment so that whenever they complete their training or certification, they are ready to step into an industry and those jobs are available. And so I think that the state has looked into exchange opportunities as well, to where we can send local workers over to Europe or to other global markets to further their expertise should they be certified prior to a local job existing here in the U.S. market. So timing is one question, again, wanting to sync all that up, but there also is a question of scope. I think there are some obvious training needs that are your typical GWO training, safety training, what have you. But on top of that, for more specific and manufacturing-based jobs, there may be very unique training requirements that will not present themselves until there are larger investments made in the local supply chain. So we know that something like operations and maintenance will be local. Therefore, we know that we need to train for that very soon. Something like tower manufacturing, however, is much less certain as far as when that will appear in local markets, and therefore the requirement for workforce training is slightly less certain as well. So the state is really looking to take some of that risk off the table with injecting $20 million of capital to establish these training programs. And again, looking to partner with international agencies and those other folks who have done this before to ensure that we're doing so correctly.
Okay, very good. And just for people on the call then that are interested in reaching out to those regarding that funding, what's the best route in doing that?
Sure. So currently, I would say that NYSERDA is the best authority on that funding. This will be led, however, by the SUNY system, which is the State University of New York. We have dozens of campuses across the state. However, for the time being, as that funding has not yet been issued, NYSERDA would be the primary point of contact. So I hope that, Emily, you're able to share contact information at the conclusion of this call, and I'm happy to engage with anyone on that topic.
That's great. Thank you very much. You touched on O&M, and maybe this is a question for Barry. Barry, given that Scotland has been at the forefront of offshore wind for many years, with a lot of capability. It's actually where I'm based with my core team of offshore wind. It's where we've our center of excellence for offshore wind. Recently enough, the Worley team and company, we've branched out into operation and maintenance in offshore wind. And I know I'm not asking this question not only for myself, but also other entities that maybe have that expertise and knowledge from the UK, from Scotland. How are you helping customers and entities break into that market, particularly on the O&M side of things? You know, there's going to need to be a level of training on the ground. There's going to need to be a level of certification. You know, and that really resides well with local staff and local residents.
Yeah.
What type of work are Scottish Development International? And that's maybe more of a question for Barry, if anything.
Yeah, and actually I can extend this to many other organizations, but obviously Sam and Matt and the other state agencies have all been very welcoming to myself and the companies that we bring into market who have worked on UK and global wind farms to develop O&M programs. Certification programs are underway at many of the state, I think Matt mentioned the SUNY, the State University of New York network. I'm sure Maryland has also engaged with its either community college or trade organizations. The Mass Maritime Academy has launched and has a GWO testing facility. So each of the states, because the O&M is going to be localized, is working within its port structures and the vocational trades as well as the unions to build up the necessary workforce that O&M is going to entail. The more challenge will be the supply and maintenance of sufficient stock and inventory, which will be another challenge. So I think we're well suited for workforce development. That's fully engaged. Our Scottish companies in UK as well as the EU organizations have been bringing people here. Obviously, Emily will mention we'll be seeing everybody at the US offshore in June. So I think we're well suited to support these wind farms as they come online.
Okay, no, very good. Thanks very much, Barry. Cheers for that. John, we touched on it before. We've touched on it a few times, actually. We're looking at, the real size of the prize in offshore wind is, if you're looking at the capital spend and then the operational spend, it obviously fits in. The real size or the real prize for development is in the O&M, but also at the front end with the fabrication. Can you maybe give an overview of your understanding of the US market's fabrication capability? Because you look at the UK and you look at the more mature markets, they are leveraging Asia as a low-cost center. Do you think that's going to happen in the US?
I think it will. I mean, there's just before we sort of go on, there's a recent trend in deep water Gulf of Mexico developments. It's been to the build hulls of floating production platforms before the crash in Southeast Asia, and then do the topside integrations carried out in the Gulf of Mexico with the jackets done. So even in a very well established supply chain, cost has driven that supply chain east. So I think we'll definitely see that, and it's not. I mean. It's because that's the sort of jobs also countries want, because obviously you've got welders, you've got storemen, you've got forklift drivers, you've got that. Not everyone is a consultant engineer, etc. Now, the UK, as we both know, has struggled with this because we didn't sort of increase the pipeline fast enough, and factories are only built once. I was involved with TAG, which is now owned by EEW, and that was a fight to get a facility there, but it's there now. So in terms of the US, it is, as you said, a really big prize, but it's not going to be a simple one because, as we mentioned, towers is you get cheaper towers for onshore wind farms from Asia, etc. But if you look at where fabrication is at the moment, there's lots of very experienced fabricators both along the Gulf Coast, in the Mexico area, if you can call it North America, but you've also got Canada as well. I mean, in terms of some of the yards that are sort of ready and fit for maybe the substation, which is probably the one that's well equated to an oil and gas fabrication because it doesn't involve sequential manufacturing. is the Kiewit Offshore Services shipyard in Texas, probably one of maybe the most qualified of yards to undertake this kind of work. Large twin boom cranes. It can be used to perform the large integration lifts required. You've got Gulf Island, which obviously produced the steel jackets for Block Island, but they've recently closed their Texas facility, but they've retained the Louisiana one. So they built 2 large lift boats recently, which is similar construction. So if you look further afield, McDermott in Altamira in Mexico, you should have the capability in the backup of Draganos in Spain. So there's quite a lot of shipyards and fabricators. The issue about the Northeast is that a lot of those yards were for construction of defence or civilian ships or ship repair, and a lot of them have actually came down. So they're going to have to be regenerated by fabrication companies, hence possible GVs.
Okay, very good. Thanks, John. Cheers for that. I think it's an exciting space, particularly from a secondary steel perspective. As the market grows and the sector currently gets filled out. Might give a quick question here to Sam from Maryland. Sam, as obviously the bids going in there recently enough, Maryland came out with some aggressive, I suppose you could call them, it was aggressive participation from a local content perspective for the developers. And we're well aware of Ørsted's win there came with the commitment to build a factory. As you see the rest of that capacity being filled, what else are you looking at from a development perspective to free up that supply chain?
It's a very good question. I would say really what we're trying to do is identify all of the companies in Maryland that already do some sort of work that could translate very well to offshore wind, and then get them involved with the Ørsted and US Wind's projects. So it's essentially it would be identifying the third-party suppliers to the secondary, to the second and first tier supplier for those projects. When it comes to some of the major component parts, right now, I'm not really aware of what is going to be looked at in the future, since we've been doing this on a case-by-case basis for each individual project.
Yeah. And given given its location, do you see there's an opportunity for it to become a hub for other states or for other opportunities?
Yes,
is there an opportunity for collaboration between states?
I mean, yes, I do believe Maryland is going to provide goods and services for projects built in New York, and I'm confident the same is going to be for New York to Maryland and vice versa, along with all the other states on the US. The way that I personally see it is, if you can, buy Maryland. If you can't buy Maryland, buy US. And then if you can't buy US, just buy wherever you want or wherever it's cheapest. Yeah. But in addition, in some respects, the different state governments, yes, we can work together on supporting the supply chain. But one of the requests I hear a lot is the states need to figure out who gets what major component part. And I don't personally think that that's ever going to happen. The states sitting down and deciding who gets what.
No, that's good, Sam. No, that's good. And look, it's an interesting dynamic given the political environment there. Yeah. Thank you for that, Emily. What I might do is I'll hand it back to you now, given the time.
Yes, great. Thank you, Owen. Well, thank you, everyone, all the speakers today. I did have a couple of questions come in, but seeing the time, what would be best to do is all of the slides and the live recording will be sent to everyone in their mailbox. And the slides do include people's contact details. So if you have a specific contact for a specific speaker, then reach out to them directly. In the meantime, thank you so much to all of our panelists for their expert insight into the US offshore wind supply chain. Once again, this is one of the many discussions that will be addressed at the US Offshore Wind Conference in Boston, June 18th and 19th. So if you did enjoy this webinar, please come to the event and download the brochure to see what else you can expect to see. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emily. Cheers.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks everybody.